James Joyce's Ulysses has earned its reputation as a modern classic, but it has also earned its reputation as a difficult book. Ulysses has been the subject of scorn, outrage, censorship, and confusion from the very moment it first saw publication. When asked to name a great but notoriously difficult work of literature, many readers will say Ulysses. And it doesn't matter how deeply and widely one has read, part of the Ulysses experience involves a little bit of frustration. But today, I would love to share with you some tips that will make your reading of this masterpiece a joyful experience, or should we say a joyful experience, because that is exactly what the reading experience of Ulysses is supposed to be. It's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be playful. It's experimental, and it most certainly is scandalous. And with the right approach, your deep reading of Ulysses will kick off a lifelong love affair with the writings of James Joyce. We are reading James Joyce's Ulysses together at the Hardcore Literature Book Club because Ulysses really lends itself to group readings. In fact, I would say it requires it. And the book also requires mediation, a guide. And there is a lot of excitement around this book, which is truly wonderful to see. And I think part of the excitement is due to the fact that readers can picture themselves overcoming the challenge of Ulysses and reaping the aesthetic and cognitive rewards. So without much further ado, let us launch into the tips and begin breaching James Joyce's Ulysses. Now, the first tip I would like to offer you is to see Ulysses as a reflection of the depth and breadth of your reading over time. What does that mean? Well, one of the reasons why Ulysses is such a difficult book is because it is packed with allusions. Allusions to other great works of literature, Shakespearean allusions, allusions to Dante, Homeric allusions and Homeric parallels, of course, but we'll get to that in a moment. It is packed with references to other texts, and those references are quite endless. Ulysses is one of the most perfect examples of a book that one cannot simply read once and say they have read it. One continues to read Ulysses over the course of their life and they always get something more out of it. And if you see Ulysses as a reflection of the work you're doing with other great works of literature, you're reading into philosophy, history, theology, whatever it might be, if you see Ulysses as a reflection of that, then it is a very exciting book to use as a benchmark. And I believe the most helpful attitude to take when it comes to allusions is one of humility, because humility defeats frustration. If you haven't read Dante, you will not discern the allusions to Dante in James Joyce's Ulysses. But if you've read Shakespeare, for example, let's just say you've done a deep reading of Shakespeare earlier in the year, well then there are sections in James Joyce's Ulysses that are going to be exhilarating for you because you'll understand the allusions, you'll be able to see what plays and what ideas Joyce is wrestling with. There are specific sections in this book where if you know Shakespeare, you will get the jokes because Joyce packs his work within jokes. And you'll find that if you are reading Ulysses over the long term, you are slowly becoming part of Joyce's club. And I say slowly because Ulysses is a book that takes time. It is a puzzle that cannot be completely solved immediately. Speaking of his much more difficult work, Finnegan's Wake, James Joyce said that it took him 17 years to write Finnegan's Wake, and he would expect it to take 17 years for the reader too. And yes, some readers might think he's mocking them. One only needs to read the accounts of his partner, Nora Barnacle, who described Joyce writing Finnegan's Wake long into the night and keeping her up by laughing. But Joyce is certainly not mocking the reader. 17 years? Well, that's a lifetime, or a fairly big whack of one's lifetime, dedicated to self-scholarship. Yes, if you return to the works of James Joyce over the course of nearly 2 decades, then you are always going to get something more out of it, because each year you're going to read more literature, you're going to immerse yourself in more great works, and you're going to pile up your knowledge. So what you take from works like Ulysses this year, if you're reading deeply and steadily, then you will take so much more from Ulysses next year, and in 3 years, and in 10 years, because simply put, self-scholarship and deep reading takes a lot of time, and I believe that's where the frustration lies, encountering the revelation of what we have not read, and we can see what we have not read by what passages we find to be obscure. But the thing is, if you know the information, if you understand the allusions that Joyce is referring to, then it's anything but obscure, and it becomes very funny, it becomes very witty, it becomes incredibly playful. And I believe strongly that Joyce is on your side. He wrote works like Ulysses for readers like you and readers like me, lovers of literature. And yes, we might say that the circle he was writing for was quite small, but he most certainly did write to be read and to be enjoyed and to be mulled over and to be read aloud and returned to over the course of many years. And I find that reading Joyce is an act of celebration of all literature. So I would advise you to think of your reading of Ulysses as encouragement for further reading. So layer in some of the writers Joyce is referring to, and you'll get so much more out of Ulysses. That means read Shakespeare. The play I recommend you begin with is Hamlet. That is the work that will pay off dividends when it comes to appreciating Ulysses. Of course, read Homer too. Read the Odyssey. If you haven't already read Homer, or it's been a little while, see your reading of Ulysses as an exciting opportunity to return to Homer, or to come to Homer for the first time and read them side by side. But in addition to reading the likes of Homer and Shakespeare, read as much as you can get your hands on. Read poetry, read history, read philosophy. Having said this, however, even if you haven't read James Joyce before, the chances are you actually have. Joyce is so incredibly ubiquitous. His influence is everywhere, and so you are likely reading him already without even knowing it. You are most likely quoting him or echoing his sentiments without even knowing it. On dealing with frustration, Derek Attridge, speaking about Finnegan's Wake, but that's definitely a topic for another day, writes that the richness of Joyce's work may be thought of as a comfort, not a threat. And Attridge encourages readers to abandon 2 assumptions about the act of reading that frequently exist side by side. One is that reading is an act of mastery, whereby the text is made to yield up all its secrets and allowed to hold nothing back. The other is that reading is a passive experience, whereby the reader receives meanings unambiguously communicated by the text. Joyce, Attridge tells us, will never be mastered, never dominated or exhausted by interpretation, nor will his work ever offer itself up unproblematically as a single set of meanings. And if a sense of control and singleness of meaning is crucial to a reader's enjoyment, frustration will be the only result. So abandon your notions that a book can be and should be mastered, and abandon the notion that there is one single meaning that will be offered up to you unproblematically. If you abandon both of those 2 assumptions, then Joyce will cease to be frustrating and you'll start to have fun with him. Speaking more to allusions, what we will do in our lecture series is encourage each other to hunt for allusions. So with each section, you will be given the task, the assignment, to find an allusion or unpack an allusion, discover its meaning or potential meanings, and introduce it to the group. Other group members can then riff on what you've presented or find an allusion themselves. And this will be really exciting because the individual lectures cannot be exhaustive. One could spend a whole hour, if not longer, on a single page and still not get to the bottom of it, still not say everything that one could possibly say about it. If you want an example of just how difficult elusive and elusive Joyce can be, I would advise you to flip to the third part of Ulysses, the Proteus section, so dubbed because of the Homeric parallel with Book 4 of Homer's Odyssey. This chapter takes place on the Strand at 11 AM, and we are with Stephen Daedalus, that's Joyce's surrogate or Joyce's alter ego, as he walks along, and the aesthetic technique is interior monologue. And this is an iconic passage, and it's a passage that many readers like to quote as proof, essentially, that they've read Ulysses. But the thing is, a lot of readers abandon the book at this point, and that's understandable because it is really difficult. You can spend a very long time on one page, heck, one sentence alone, and the entire book isn't like that. We'll talk about that in a moment. But it's the passage that begins, "Ineluctable modality of the visible. Signatures of all things I am here to read, sea spawn and sea wrack, the nearing tide, that rusty boot, snot green, blue silver rust, coloured signs." There is practically no action in this section. We are simply following Stephen's thoughts as they happen, and this is a masterful and significant display of stream of consciousness, much more masterful than almost any other writer has accomplished previously, because it's fragmented and it's unexplained. When we are thinking our thoughts, do we need to qualify everything we say? Do we need to explain what we're thinking and why, and what a certain thought means to an external observer? No, because we take it that there isn't an external observer. And so we are given a glimpse into Stephen's interiority, and in doing so, we realise how incredibly underread we are, because Stephen's fragmented stream of consciousness boasts an awe-inspiring understanding of literature and philosophy and history. In one page alone, if we are to have any hope at interpreting Stephen's thoughts, we need to have an understanding of Jacob Boehme, we need to have an understanding of William Blake, of Aristotle, of Berkeley, of Dante, and quite a bit more. And in addition to understanding these disparate allusions, we also need to resign ourselves to the fact that what we are experiencing is a joyful handling of language itself. Many critics have said that the language Joyce uses is the star of the show when it comes to Ulysses. The language is the story. The language is the main character. The language is the exciting thing. Stuart Gilbert tells us that this episode displays a conscious virtuosity in the handling of language as an end in itself, and an exploitation of the effective resonance of words. So with our lecture series, we are going to have an allusion hunting assignment. With each section covered, we will be collating allusions and crowdsourcing understanding, and rather like going to a dinner party, you don't want to turn up empty-handed, we will be bringing some allusions to the discussion that we would like to discuss in depth. As we make our way through these tips in this video, I would encourage you to flip to the sections I'm referring to and give them a little read and try to get a feel of the different sections of Ulysses. Yep, this is not the way one typically reads a book. One typically reads a book from start to finish, and one doesn't want the story to be spoiled, but Ulysses is not any book, and it does require a unique approach. And I believe that part of that unique approach involves listening, which brings us to my second tip for you, which is to read and listen to Ulysses simultaneously. My top audiobook recommendation for Ulysses is available on Audible and is narrated by Jim Norton and Marcella Riordan. And there is music prefacing each chapter, and it really does make the story and the sense, the meaning of it all come alive. Now, there are great narrators for some of Joyce's other works too. Chris O'Dowd delivers a tremendous narration of Dubliners, whilst Colin Farrell's narration of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is splendid too. So seriously, when it comes to James Joyce, put your Audible membership to work. Now, why am I recommending listening and reading this work? Well, because Ulysses is overtly and by design a musical work. It is supposed to be appreciated on the ear. You're supposed to hear Joyce's melody, and hearing the melody unlocks the meaning. You're supposed to give life to it with your vocal cords too. You're supposed to delight in what Ezra Pound would refer to as the melopeia. Joyce himself was a trained singer and by all accounts had a very beautiful voice, and his father was a very famous tenor, one of the most famous tenors in all of Ireland. And Dublin at that time was a musical city. Singers would come from all over the world to put on performances in Dublin, and the Dubliners loved concerts and listening to music. Now, it's true for any great work of literature that listening unlocks meaning, and sub-vocalizing or just full-on vocalizing will also unlock meaning, but there is perhaps no work that better demonstrates this than Ulysses. If there is a better work, then it is surely Finnegan's Wake. Finnegan's Wake, as well as Ulysses, is notoriously a very difficult novel, but I would protest that if one were to read Finnegan's Wake aloud or listen to it being read aloud, you would surprise yourself at just how much sense and meaning is unlocked, meaning that you wouldn't get just glancing at the words on the page. Joyce is difficult until he is read aloud. And there are multiple sections in Ulysses that attempt to take language, attempt to take words to the realm of music. One of Joyce's aesthetic and critical heroes, Walter Pater, would say famously in his studies in the history of the Renaissance that all art constantly aspires to the condition of music. And if you want to see what this looks like taken to the absolute extreme, then I would encourage you to turn to chapter 11, The Sirens. If you have the Penguin Modern Classics edition, this will be around page 328. Joyce telegrammed this section from Switzerland to Ireland, and the censor thought it had to be a code because it didn't make any sense. But after they got a little team of experts in, they came to the conclusion that it was merely eccentric literature. The Sirens chapter is Joyce's attempt to take the word to the level of musical composition, and it contains a fugal opening and the pattern of a fugue with themes and motifs that will be developed over the course of the chapter. At the start of the chapter, the words are seemingly meaningless, but they recur and accrue meaning over the course of that chapter. A husky fife note blue, blue, blue bloom is on the gold pinnacled hair. A jumping rose on satiny breasts of satin, rose of Castile, trilling, trilling, ay Dolores, peep, who's in the peep of gold. Tink cried to bronze in pity, and a call, pure, long and throbbing, long in dying call. Yeah, why on earth anybody would find reading Ulysses a frustrating experience is beyond me. No, seriously, that's difficult stuff. What you will see over the course of that chapter is that motifs recur and words that are seemingly meaningless at the start are elaborated upon, and through that elaboration, meaning arises. So you go from a position of confusion to clarity if you can stick with it. And it really does help if you hear it read aloud, because at the beginning those words are deployed for their tonal qualities, their musical qualities, and the meaning comes later. James Joyce's Ulysses is pure oral tradition, to the point that many critics will invite us to read Ulysses as a poem. That's what Jennifer Levine recommends. Read Ulysses as a poem, she says. To read Ulysses as a poem is to assume that it will reward scrupulous attention, and that the intensity with which you focus on a short lyric may, no must, equally be given to every page of this very long work. Nothing is contingent or insignificant. And that is part of the reason why many readers find Ulysses difficult, because poetry is difficult. We don't read through a poem once, get the meaning, and move on to the next poem. The meaning of a poem develops across time and with repeated readings, reading aloud. In that way, Ulysses is very much like a poem. My next recommendation for you is to have a crib beside you as you make your way through Ulysses. Have a crib that tells you the structure of the book. Have a crib that will reveal each section's mythic and aesthetic scheme. And as you make your way through Ulysses, give yourself the assignment to collect your favourite episodes. Now, just because you struggle with one part of Ulysses doesn't mean you will struggle with the whole work. Many readers will abandon the work when they get into difficulty because they think that it might continue on like that. Not all sections are equally difficult. Some are really, really difficult, but some of them are very, very simple and straightforward. Some sections are straightforward narrative, and some sections are very straightforward in how Joyce is being playful. But other sections do require mediation and a little bit of a guide and a tip-off as to what is going on in that section. Each section has a corresponding episode in Homer's Odyssey, which was made all the more overt by Joyce after the fact. Now, readers and publishers and academics have agreed to refer to each of the sections with a title that designates the Homeric parallel. And very often, the Homeric parallels are rather tenuous, but very often they're incredibly ironic and they are quite funny as well. But much of the time you do need to know what you're looking for. In addition to each section having a parallel with Homer's Odyssey, each section takes place at a different time of the day, in a different location. Each section has an aesthetic technique. Sections will have a specific art that they are preoccupied with. Philology, theology, history. Sections will have their own colour, their own symbol, sometimes even their own organ. And I would reiterate that if you haven't enjoyed Homer's Odyssey already, then do see your reading of James Joyce's Ulysses as a chance to do exactly that. There are countless great translations of Homer's Odyssey to choose from. We even did a little taste test ourselves. There's Emily Wilson, there's Samuel Butler, there's Robert Fagles, there's Richmond Lattimore, there's the Lombardo edition, which is I rather like. The very first episode is the Telemachus episode. I still remember my very first reading of this episode. I believe I was maybe 11 or 12 years old. I remember reading this in the school library, and whilst of course I didn't understand Ulysses, I was intoxicated by the language, and I would spend hours writing my own Joyce knockoffs trying to replicate the musicality of James Joyce. The Telemachus episode opens, "Stately, plump Buck Mulligan came from the stairhead bearing a bowl of lather on which a mirror and a razor lay crossed. A yellow dressing gown, ungirdled, was sustained gently behind him by the mild morning air. He held the bowl aloft and intoned, 'In Troibo ad altare Dei.'" When the book opens, it's 8 a.m. and the first scene takes place in the Martello Tower. These Martello Towers were defensive coastal forts, and you can still visit the very one where Joyce himself spent 6 nights in 1904 with the very real Buck Mulligan. Buck Mulligan being based on his friend Oliver St. John Gogarty. In that first scene, we meet Stephen Daedalus, though readers who have enjoyed a portrait of the artist as a young man will already be familiar with Stephen, and the aesthetic technique in the Telemachus episode is straight narrative. Telemachus, of course, is the son of Odysseus, or Ulysses, in Homer's Odyssey. The corresponding character in Joyce's work being Mr. Leopold Bloom, who we meet in the 4th section, Calypso. Now, one of my personal favourite sections, and this is one of the sections that I return to most frequently, if I want to take Ulysses down from the shelf and open it at random, rather than read it all the way through, I typically go to this section first. It's chapter 9, and the Homeric parallel is Scylla and Charybdis. If you've read the Odyssey, you will know that Scylla and Charybdis are the destructive and immortal sea beasts that Odysseus has to sail between. Chapter 9 takes place in the library. It's 2 in the afternoon, and the technique is dialectic. And this is where we are treated to Stephen Daedalus's theory of Hamlet. Or was it Joyce's theory? We do know that whilst he was exiled in Trieste, he gave a series of lectures on Hamlet that we unfortunately do not have access to today. Buck Mulligan, early on in Ulysses and with his tongue in his cheek, says that Stephen proves by algebra that Hamlet's grandson is Shakespeare's grandfather and that he himself is the ghost of his own father. But it's actually a rather involved theory, and it leads to this beautiful passage. On page 273, if you're working from the Penguin Modern Classics edition, I love this passage because it hits upon something that I have thought about rather in depth myself, and I find a kinship with James Joyce through our shared appreciation of William Shakespeare, though of course Joyce was competing for top spot with Shakespeare when it came to linguistic inventiveness and virtuosity. But for the longest time I've disagreed with critics who say that Shakespeare cannot be found in his works, making exceptions of course for the sonnets and Hamlet. Yes, he is there in the sonnets, but there is a lot of persona. Yes, Hamlet is his most intimate and personal play, but I read Shakespeare and I see Shakespeare everywhere. And we get this wonderful passage that goes like this: every life is many days, day after day. We walk through ourselves, meeting robbers, ghosts, giants, old men, young men, wives, widows, brothers in love, but always meeting ourselves. And that's what I love about Shakespeare, and it's what I love about Joyce, and it's what I love about great literature generally. We are afforded an opportunity to meet ourselves, to walk through ourselves, and to see something of us in another. When talking about the value of reading and experiencing great literature, we often emphasize this idea of knowing yourself. But how do we know ourselves? We know ourselves by experiencing otherness and experiencing connection to otherness. Now, another favourite chapter of mine is chapter 14, The Oxen of the Sun. And this scene takes place in a hospital. And the aesthetic technique is embryonic development. This is a chapter of parodies and again requires mediation, because what we are experiencing in this chapter is the growth of the English language in a rather compressed space. And it is truly, truly delightful stuff. To name just a few styles in this passage, we have the inflections of John Bunyan, we have Thomas Malory, we have Sir Thomas Browne, we have the Anglo-Saxon alliterative poetic tradition, we have the language of old church sermons, we have long stretches that read like translations from Latin, we have Defoe and Dickens and so much more. Then of course we have Marilyn Monroe's favourite chapter. She was famously pictured reading Ulysses in a park, and we could tell by the position of the book that she was reading the final chapter, Penelope, which treats us to the interiority of Molly Bloom. And it's a really personal, intimate interior monologue. Experiencing the interior monologue of Molly Bloom may well lead to one agreeing with Carl Jung that Joyce displayed a masterful understanding of female psychology. Of course, James's partner Nora may have disagreed, because when such a sentiment was put to her, she would say something to the effect of, Jim doesn't know the first thing about women. I don't care what anybody says. It'd be much better for the world to be governed by the women in it. You wouldn't see women going and killing one another and slaughtering. When do you ever see women rolling around drunk like they do, or gambling every penny they have and losing it on horses? Yes, because a woman, whatever she does, she knows where to stop. So that was just a very small tasting platter of the different styles in Ulysses. There are many more episodes, but just to give you a sense of the range and the difference in aesthetic technique. And my next tip when it comes to breaching Ulysses is to understand the story ahead of time. Forget about spoilers. Now, when it comes to other works of literature, I do my best to avoid spoilers. And I strongly believe that if one hasn't read a classic work, they should valiantly try to preserve the surprises that are in store for them. But Ulysses is different. One doesn't really read Ulysses for the story. I'm kind of reminded of something that Samuel Johnson said about Richardson's Clarissa, and reading Richardson for the sentiment rather than the story. One reads Ulysses for the language, and that is what is going to shock you the most, rather than developments in the story. The story itself is actually rather simple. Ulysses takes place across one day, June 16th, 1904, today now known as Bloomsday, after our hero, Leopold Bloom. The 16th of June is celebrated all over Ireland and indeed all over the world. It's celebrated by readings of Joyce. I myself celebrated Bloomsday this year by dipping into Ulysses, enjoying some of Joyce's chamber music, that's a selection of his poetry, reading a little bit of Finnegan's Wake, and of course enjoying my favourite episodes of Ulysses. But two things that strike me when I think about Bloomsday. The first is that I'm not sure Joyce would be that thrilled to see Bloomsday celebrated as it is, and secondly, I do wonder how many people realise what they are celebrating. Yes, of course, ostensibly we are celebrating Joyce, we're celebrating Ulysses, we're celebrating great literature, triumphing over the censor, because the censorship debate is really interesting, and Ulysses has a very deep history when it comes to censorship. But essentially, what we are celebrating when we celebrate June 16th, 1904, we're celebrating the day that James Joyce came into his sexual awakening with his partner and muse, Nora Barnacle. In fact, we're celebrating the day that Nora Barnacle gave James Joyce a little bit of hand relief. Nora and James would then flee Ireland and go to live in France, in Switzerland, in Italy, and raise children together. James Joyce famously signs off Ulysses by writing Trieste-Zürich-Paris 1914 to 1921, and there is a lot of weight in that sign-off. Ulysses is the great modernist novel, the great novel of the early 20th century, and it is the great European novel too. Ulysses follows the lives of a bunch of Dubliners across one day. Our central protagonists are Stephen Daedalus, Leopold Bloom, and Molly Bloom. But if you've read A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, if you've read Dubliners, you will see many minor characters recur throughout Ulysses, and there's a lot of delight to be had in Joyce's intertextuality. Now, these works can be read separately and independently, but they also have a strong relationship to each other. And if you find yourself falling in love with Ulysses, then you will want to read all of Joyce's canon, all of his oeuvre over the long term, and you'll get all the more out of the individual moving parts, because they are connected. They're separate and connected. Stephen Daedalus has been called home, back to Ireland, after his father has urged him to come home because his mother is dying. There's heavy amounts of autobiography in this, because this was exactly James Joyce's experience too. And Ulysses opens and Stephen's mother has passed away. And whilst we may find ourselves enjoying the experience of getting to know the central protagonists, Dublin itself and this moment in time is a character. And there is an irony to Joyce's Homeric parallels, perhaps the kind of irony that only an Irish wit in exile could muster. The irony is there because the minutiae is blown up to epic proportions. But alongside the irony, there's also an element of truth, because we do that in our own lives too, don't we? We blow up the micro to the macro. The minutiae of our lives takes on epic proportions. We are the heroic protagonists of our own epics, aren't we? And so with Ulysses, we get a selective but incredibly distinct and faithful picture of Dublin at a moment in time. With Stephen Daedalus, we can see how Joyce can throw up multiple meanings with just a name. With the name Stephen, we see an identification with Saint Stephen, the first Christian martyr, who was stoned to death for his provocative sermonizing. And with Daedalus, we also have the identification with the Daedalus Icarus myth of classical mythology. Daedalus being the maker of wings and architect in a labyrinth on Crete with his son. He fashioned these wings for himself and his son, and he implored his son to fly a middling course and not fly too close to the sun, because the sun would burn or heat the wings. And what happens? The sun does not listen, and he flies too close to the sun and falls into the water below. We see that Joyce develops bird motifs to do with flying and singing over the course of his works. And Leopold Bloom, or Poldy, is a 38-year-old man with Jewish heritage but raised Protestant and then changed to Catholicism in order to satisfy the requirements of marrying his wife Molly. Poldy is passive and timid in every single way, and he is essentially a tragic hero, a tragic passive anti-hero. He is cuckolded by his wife, and he works as an advertising canvasser for a Dublin newspaper. He is scorned and derided, and he is essentially an exile at home. But due to the misfortunes heaped upon Poldy, he has that very quality that so many writers seek with their creations: humanity. Mr. Leopold Bloom is one of the most humane characters in all of literature. Now, in addition to Joyce gifting us characters who are intensely psychologically complex, these characters also represent different things, or they can represent different things. Stephen represents the intellect, Bloom represents the unsuccessful fusion of mind and body, whilst Molly represents the flesh. We also have ironic Homeric parallels set up too. Bloom is Odysseus, Molly is wife Penelope, and Stephen is son Telemachus, though he believes himself to be Hamlet. Now, my next tip for your deep reading of Ulysses is an attitude tip, because how you approach something very often will determine or influence the outcome. If you approach something with a feeling of dread, a feeling of suspicion, a feeling of confusion, then you may find that your reading experience doesn't yield you very much. But I believe you should approach Ulysses with an attitude of play. You should approach this work with a sense of joy. And you should also keep in mind that there isn't a correct way to approach Ulysses. If you approach this book with the assumption that what you're about to encounter is a frustrating conundrum, then you will get that. But if you approach this book and expect to get some laughs out of it, then you will. And one of the things that I'm most proud of when it comes to my Irish heritage is the fact that the Irish do irony and wit. The Irish do humour so well. My parents come from East London. We have Irish on both sides, but on my father's side specifically, my family are immigrants that came over from Dublin, rather close to where James Joyce himself would have been born and raised. And I cannot help but think of my grandmother when I read Ulysses. She had books on Joyce's Dublin, and though I wasn't old enough to enjoy a deep conversation about the work with her, I have a feeling that she very much enjoyed James Joyce. Now, another tip that I would like to extend to you is to consider using different works by James Joyce as an entrance into Ulysses. Ulysses isn't the most difficult thing Joyce wrote. That award, most certainly, as you already know, goes to Finnegan's Wake. But there are easier entrances to Joyce. I personally believe the easiest entrance is Joyce's Dubliners, a short story collection that he wrote when he was a young man. The writing is a lot more straightforward, but it's also very precise, and Joyce is doing some really masterful things in these short stories too, though it's not nearly as experimental as Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. A reading of Dubliners is a fantastic complement to your reading of Ulysses. Why not pick up a copy of Dubliners and treat yourself to one new story per week as you read through Ulysses? You'll find the experience to be really rewarding. My personal favourite stories in Dubliners, though of course it's so difficult to choose, are The Dead, which is one of the best short stories of all time, and Evelyn. I find the precision of Evelyn to be delightful. The opening line is, "She sat at the window watching the evening invade the avenue." Oh, how much one can do with the perfect word, the right word. And with Dubliners, I believe we see the modernist writer, and Joyce most certainly is the poster pin-up when it comes to modernist writers. We see the modernist writer's indebtedness to Gustave Flaubert. Evelyn, by the way, was first published under the pseudonym Stephen Daedalus. And did you know that Ulysses itself was originally designed to be a short story, Mr. Hunter in Dublin? You also have a portrait of the artist as a young man, which is an invaluable companion to Ulysses. This one may seem simple, and it is simple, but the simplicity is a little bit of a deception, but it's a very good one, and it's a great companion. It's also a great entrance to Ulysses. Now, my next tip for you, it's something that I've already kind of hit upon, is read Joyce to understand modernism, because Joyce is modernism. Now, we have a video in the Hardcore Literature Book Club called The Rise of Modernism, which is part of the History of Literature lecture series, and we have more videos on the way dealing with modernism. So this tip is going to be necessarily reductive. But what do we mean when we say modernism? Very simply and reductively put, we are talking about forms of literature that are experimental, novel, new. We started referring to certain writers, and most particularly Joyce, as modern or modernist from the 60s onwards. Now, if we want to talk post-60s, we're going to start straying into post-modernism territory. When we talk of modernism, we're typically talking about those writers in the first quarter and a little bit beyond of the 20th century. So Virginia Woolf, Marcel Proust, James Joyce, these are three exemplar. To effectively understand modernism, one has to see what came before. To understand what is contemporary around the time of Joyce writing Ulysses, one needs to know what the reading public were used to. And the reading public were used to novels by Charles Dickens and George Eliot, with omniscient narrators who have an awareness of the reader and clarify everything for us. But as Marvin Magelner puts it brilliantly in clarifying the ethos of James Joyce, he implores us to keep in mind that what counts is the recording of the characters' thoughts as they develop. So if we're talking about Stephen Daedalus, we're talking about the recording of the thoughts of an artist, sensitive enough to discern the artistic pattern into which they flow, and from which they will attain a meaning more universal than any one or any group of them might separately contain. Unlike Dickens, Joyce's sole concern is to present what in the external world is important to Stephen's private mental and psychological processes. That means we are confronted with a work that is deliberately dense and difficult. And when we talk about modernism, we are talking about deliberate difficulty. We're also talking about self-awareness, and we're talking about intertextuality. Norman Cantor, in his model of modernism, tells us that modernism focuses on the micro as opposed to the macro, and so we are treated to intensely individual novels rather than social novels, so that's a check there for Joyce. Cantor tells us that there is intense self-referentiality, so modern works are about themselves, and they are texts that aren't exactly representational. These modern works are also disjointed. So with the Victorian novels, there's incredible harmony. That's out the window when it comes to modernism, and it's not difficult to see why when one considers the events that took place, the atrocities, and the intense alienation that many artists, indeed many people, felt over the course of the early to mid-20th century. Modernism can also be unapologetically elitist and also make comments upon such elitism, but it also deals with a more open discussion of sexuality and is sympathetic to feminism, is sympathetic to different sexualities, and is open to discussing reversing or subverting typical gender norms. With modern novels as well, aesthetics is prized. We can find the modern precursors in writers like Flaubert, Dostoevsky, Zola, and also Henry James, all four of whom sought to improve upon realism. When we look at modern works of literature, Be it a James Joyce's Ulysses or T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, what we are seeing is literature in crisis and literature needing to evolve, and sometimes that evolution requires a little bit of destruction, creation built off the back of decreation. And T.S. Eliot, talking about the Odyssey parallels with James Joyce's Ulysses, said that those parallels made the modern world possible for art. Going into the 20th century, there was an incredible anxiety about where the artist could go. And a lot of these modern works of literature that we still find difficulty with today, most certainly the readers of the time, even the incredibly well-read, found difficulty with them too. I think of Virginia Woolf, great writer, great modernist writer, another modernist poster pin-up, who called Ulysses the work of a queasy undergraduate squeezing his spots, something to that effect. And T.S. Eliot implored her to read it again, and she corrected her opinion. When it comes to modernism, there's also an intense awareness about form. So when we talk about narrative, we typically talk about content or form. Essentially, there is the content, what is being said, the story, and the style or how it's being said. And with many modern works or works of modernist literature, the content is subservient to the style. And that is something you should keep in mind when enjoying Ulysses too. Now, my next tip for you when it comes to Ulysses might initially sound like a strange one, but it means a lot to me. Read Ulysses because you can. Ulysses had a difficult and staggered and tumultuous birth. It was so difficult to get Ulysses into the world. Ulysses could put publishers behind bars, and Ulysses was at the centre of one of the literary world's biggest and most controversial censorship trials. If you want a tremendous literary biography or literary history that deals with this topic masterfully, then I highly recommend a work called The Most Dangerous Book, The Battle for James Joyce's Ulysses by Kevin Birmingham. My copy tells me on the front cover that this book won the award for Best Work of Non-Fiction in the year of 2014. It's easily one of the best works of non-fiction, the best historical works or best literary biographies I have ever read. It is exhilarating. Now, maybe I'm biased because I know many of the characters who take centre stage in this work, and I find it interesting to see how they all kind of worked together, interacted together, but it is objectively a fascinating work, and I highly recommend, if you are finding Ulysses difficult, to read around the history of how it came into the world, because we are very lucky and incredibly indebted to James Joyce today, who really pushed the boat out, really fought for free speech and freedom to write what he wanted to write. And of course, this was fought at every step of the way. So many brave men and women fought for the right to say the things we say today, and we most certainly shouldn't take that for granted. In the Hardcore Literature Book Club, we will have a show dedicated to Ulysses and censorship, but in the meantime, I would implore you to pick up a copy of the book yourself. It is fascinating. Now, you probably will find certain sections of Ulysses to be quite surprising and scandalous. Now, Ulysses certainly isn't as naughty or as dirty as some of the private love letters Joyce wrote to Nora. Seriously, I need to give you a heads up there if you decide to source some of those out yourself. But allow me to share with you a little piece from one of the passages that was held up in the courts. It was chapter 13 that was being held up in the courts, primarily the Nausicaa episode, with the lame Gertie McDowell being the Homeric parallel there. Here's a passage that censors thought would corrupt the youth. They were terrified that young women, in particular, would read such passages and then become incredibly sexually licentious. And here's a passage. And she saw a long Roman candle going up over the trees, up, and in the tense hush, They were all breathless with excitement as it went higher and higher, and she had to lean back more and more to look up after it. High, high, almost out of sight, and her face was suffused with a divine and entrancing blush from straining back, and he could see her other things too. Nainsook knickers, the fabric that caresses the skin, better than those other petty width, the green 4 and 11, on account of being white. And she let him, and she saw that he saw, and then it went so high, it went out of sight a moment. And she was trembling in every limb from being bent so far back. He had a full view, high up above her knee. No one ever, not even on the swing or wading, and she wasn't ashamed, and he wasn't either, to look in that immodest way like that. And then a rocket sprang and bang, shot blind, and oh! Then the Roman candle burst, and it was like a sigh of oh, and everyone cried, oh, oh, in raptures, and it gushed out of it, a stream of rain, gold hair threads, and they shed, and ah! They were all greeny, dewy stars, falling with golden, oh so lively, oh so soft, sweet, soft. Now, thanks to James Joyce, you might be thinking, well, that's not too scandalous, is it? Well, there are passages that are, in my opinion, much more scandalous. Now, my next tip is concerning editions. Which edition of Ulysses should you plump for? My recommendation here is for you to not get too bogged down in the debate over which edition to choose. You may find the decision around which edition is best to be utterly and understandably disorienting. Now, if you want me to be super prescriptive and just tell you get this edition, then I would highly recommend you get this one, which is super common, very easily available. This is the Penguin Modern Classics edition. Ulysses was actually first published in serial form in a little periodical called The Little Review from 1918 to 1920. Yale Press have recently brought out this marvellous edition that seeks to replicate the experience of reading Ulysses in serial fashion. Now, you don't have every episode here in this edition because the running of The Little Review was halted due to the censorship trials, and then James Joyce wanted to get it out in book form in a complete book with Sylvia Beach's Shakespeare and Co. edition. Now, it does make a really fun exercise to follow the serialized publication schedule with Ulysses, and not only that, but to read the other works of literature that would have been in the same issue as the different episodes. We can see, for example, that the first episode, which came out in March 1918, has the Telemachus episode of Ulysses by James Joyce, but also has works from Ezra Pound and Arthur Symonds. Alongside the fourth episode, we have poems by Wallace Stevens, we have William Carlos Williams, we have Carl Sandburg, Sherwood Anderson, Juna Barnes, and so that's a really great way to scaffold some secondary reading onto your experience of Joyce's Ulysses. Again, I'll talk more about how you might want to do this in the lecture series at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. Now, you will undoubtedly hear, talk, or read about how the 1922 version is the original text, and readers are referring to the iconic Shakespeare and Co. volume published by Sylvia Beach. In my opinion, whilst you may wish to choose this one, I personally think it is unnecessary unless you are a Joyce scholar. A Joyce scholar who makes their career, as my first year tutor said, a fan of James Joyce, he said that Joyce scholars make their career out of moving a comma from here to here. Endless debates in the margins, that's what Joyce scholarship is all about. Whilst readers might refer to the 1922 Shakespeare and Co. edition as the original, that doesn't mean it's the best And there shouldn't be a purist attitude when it comes to this, because Joyce himself was dissatisfied with that edition and would go on to make many revisions. If you read Kevin Birminham's masterful work on the censorship issues surrounding Ulysses, you'll see why it was important to get Ulysses out when and in whatever capacity one could get it out. And so Joyce continued to revise his masterpiece over the years. And that edition, whilst iconic, is most certainly not objectively the best. In fact, it has a ton of mistakes in it. There are other historically significant editions. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Again, my recommendation is to go for the Penguin Modern Classics version. If you want to be fancy, there's this brilliant illustrated coffee table version with the work illustrated by Eduardo Arroyo. It's absolutely beautiful. Now, it's obviously not portable, and this isn't really designed for one's first reading. It's more designed to leaf through and appreciate the gorgeous artwork. So I'd say get this only if you already have an edition that you can work through, that you can write on, that you can dog ear, and the Penguin Modern Classics version is the best for that, in my opinion. The Penguin Modern Classics is portable, it's got plenty of room for marginalia. Yes, please do dirty your pages with ink, though I've been told that this one has been selling out recently, which is rather interesting. But if you can get hold of this one, it's also authoritative, and it is the one I will be personally referencing in the Hardcore Literature Book Club lecture series. I will be referring to page numbers in this edition. Having said that, if you have another edition, you can still follow along, and in fact that will result in a really interesting discussion, because one of the most fascinating things when it comes to deep reading great literature is noting the discrepancy between different editions. So there's a really fun conversation to be had there too. And my final recommendation for you today is to embrace group readings. Read James Joyce's Ulysses with a group. Derek Attridge talking about Finnegan's Wake, but this advice is definitely applicable to Ulysses too. Attridge writes that different readers find different things in a text, making it impossible to hypothesize a typical reader. And probably more than any other book in existence, Finnegan's Wake, and I would throw Ulysses in there too, responds superbly to group readings. Each member of the group contributes his or her particular insights, which in turn trigger others, in a process which creates a growing network of meanings and patterns. Often a suggestion advanced tentatively by one member. This seems ridiculous, but I can't help hearing ... bears instant fruit as other members offer related perceptions of their own. What I wish to do is imagine a group of new readers from different backgrounds tackling the book, armed with a minimum of prior knowledge, but having available for use as the discussion progresses a good dictionary and a good encyclopedia. And that really is the reward of reading a great work of literature with a group. And this is why I encourage readers to embrace the frivolous. Embrace those ideas that you think are probably not insightful and don't feel silly. Push out tentatively those ideas, those musings that you think won't go anywhere, that won't bear any fruit, because very often the most insightful things come from those very thoughts. And so what we're going to be doing together with our group reading at the Hardcore Literature Book Club is we will have the guided reading experience, we'll have the lectures breaking down the meaning of each of the episodes, and then we will have the discussion where we offer up our own interpretations and we find allusions and we break apart the meaning together. And it is going to make for an exhilarating, rewarding and joyful, or should I say joyceful, reading experience. And so those are some of my tips when it comes to breaching this work of great literature. And I wish you all the very best for your deep reading of James Joyce's Ulysses. Breach this work with joy, with a sense of playfulness, and take your time and you will be rewarded. Now I would like to turn it over to you, and I would like to ask for your experience with James Joyce. Have you read Ulysses before? Have you tried to read Ulysses? Have you tried and then abandoned it? That's an incredibly common experience. If so, how far did you get? And what prompted you to abandon the work? What are you hoping to get out of your reading experience this time around? Let us know, and I'd like to say thank you very much for watching today. I hope you have a lovely day and happy reading.